The roar of the crowd still echoed in Mark Anderson's ears as the Arantz guards dragged him from the blood-stained arena. His body ached with every step, his muscles screaming from the exertion of the fight. His skin was slick with sweat and blood, some his, most of it not. Every breath was a reminder of how close he'd come to death, and the pounding in his head made it impossible to think clearly. Mark had survived the arena, but only just. He had fought beings from across the galaxy, creatures with claws, fangs, and brute strength far beyond anything he'd faced in his past life as an MMA fighter on Earth. But here, in this pit of savagery, it had been kill or be killed. He had killed, and he had won. Now, the Arantz guards pushed him into a new cell. Unlike the cold, dark cage they had thrown him into before the fight, this one was different. It was larger, cleaner, with a hard bed and even a small toilet in the corner. The walls weren't just bare metal. There were strange carvings, almost decorative. A small, dim light flickered above, offering a faint, sterile glow. Mark stumbled to the bed and collapsed onto it, his body protesting every movement. His chest heaved with exhaustion as he stared up at the ceiling, the events of the day swirling in his mind. He had fought in brutal pits before, back on Earth, but this was a whole different level. There had been no rules, no referee to stop the fight. Just raw, unrelenting violence. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the memories, but the images of the arena flashed behind his eyelids. The creatures he had faced, the blood, the screams. He barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching his cell until he felt a cold hand on his neck. His eyes snapped open, and he turned his head to see an alien standing over him. The creature was small, barely 4 feet tall, with a humanoid shape, but features that were distinctly alien. Its skin was a sickly yellow, and where a mouth should have been, there were writhing tentacles. Its eyes were large and black, reflecting the dim light of the cell. Before Mark could react, the creature pressed a small device against the back of his neck. There was a sharp prick, like a needle piercing his skin, and then a rush of warmth spread through his body. His vision blurred for a moment, and a strange buzzing filled his ears. The alien stepped back, watching him with an expression that Mark couldn't quite read. Then it spoke, its voice a series of clicks and guttural sounds that made no sense. But as the seconds passed, the buzzing in Mark's ears began to fade, and the alien's words shifted into something he could understand. "I am a doctor," the alien said in a calm, almost soothing voice. Its tentacles twitched as it examined Mark, its dark eyes scanning him from head to toe. That shot was a universal translator. "You will now understand me, as well as many others." Mark grunted in response, his body too tired to protest. The alien moved closer, running a small device over his wounds. Mark winced as a dull pain shot through his side, but the device seemed to ease the ache as it passed over him, sealing cuts and reducing swelling. The doctor worked in silence for several minutes, treating Mark's bruises and broken skin with quiet efficiency. When it was done, it stepped back, its tentacles curling slightly. "You fought well," the alien said, though its tone carried no emotion. "Rest now. You will need your strength." And with that, the doctor turned and left the cell, the door sliding shut behind it with a soft hiss. Mark lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing despite the exhaustion that weighed down his body. The alien doctor's words echoed in his head. "You fought well." It wasn't praise, not really. Just a statement of fact. He had fought well enough to survive, but at what cost? As the adrenaline from the fight wore off, the full weight of his situation began to sink in. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a gladiator, a pawn in some sick game for the amusement of the Arantz and their allies. And now that he had won, they would expect more from him. His mind drifted back to Earth, to the day it had all ended. The day the Dragul had descended upon his home and torn everything apart. He had fought then too, leading a resistance against the invaders. But it hadn't been enough. Earth had fallen, and its people had scattered among the stars, hunted by enemies and betrayed by those they thought were allies. Now here he was, fighting again. Always fighting. For survival, for his people, for some slim hope of freedom. But how long could he keep this up? How long before the arena claimed him, like it had claimed so many others? Sleep finally claimed him, dragging him down into a restless, dreamless void. Mark awoke to the sound of the cell door opening. His body ached, But the alien doctor's treatment had done its job. Most of his wounds had healed, though he still felt stiff and sore. An Arantz guard stood in the doorway, its insectoid face expressionless. It made a series of clicking noises, but thanks to the translator, Mark understood it clearly. "The overseer wishes to see you," the guard said, motioning for Mark to follow. Mark stood, his body protesting as he moved, and followed the guard out of the cell. They walked through the labyrinthine corridors of the ship, the sterile metallic walls reflecting the faint light. As they passed other cells, Mark caught glimpses of other prisoners, humans, aliens, all trapped in this twisted hell. Eventually, they reached a large door at the end of the corridor. The guard pressed a panel, and the door slid open with a hiss. Mark stepped inside. The room was far more ornate than the rest of the ship. The walls were lined with strange alien artwork, and the floor was covered in soft, dark material that felt almost like fur underfoot. In the center of the room sat a desk behind which was an Arantz, smaller than the guards but no less imposing. Its mandibles clicked as it regarded Mark with cold, calculating eyes. "I am Zeno," the Arantz said, its voice smooth and calm. "I oversee the fights, the games. I must say, your performance in the arena was impressive." Mark said nothing, his jaw clenched as he stood before the overseer. Zeno tilted its head, as if amused by Mark's silence. "Are you comfortable in your new accommodations? I had you moved after your victory. If you continue to fight and win, your situation will improve even further. You could have luxuries beyond what you can imagine." "I'm not your puppet," Mark growled, his voice low but filled with defiance. "I won't fight for your amusement." Zeno's mandibles clicked together, and for a moment the room was filled with a tense silence. Then the overseer spoke again, its tone colder this time. "You misunderstand your position, human. You will fight because you must. You see, I hold the fate of many of your kind in my hands. If you refuse to comply, others will suffer, your people will suffer." Mark's fists clenched at his sides, but he remained silent, glaring at the overseer. Zeno continued, seemingly unbothered by Mark's defiance. "In some rare instances, other species enjoy meeting the warriors who perform in the arena. They pay handsomely for the opportunity. And I have received a request, a royal family from the Moors. They have never met a human before, and the king's daughters are most curious." Mark's stomach churned at the thought. He had heard of the Moors, a powerful species with a reputation for cruelty and indulgence. The idea of being paraded around like some exotic animal for their amusement made his skin crawl. Zeno leaned forward, its black eyes gleaming. "You will meet them. You will be civil, and you will comply, because if you don't, your people will pay the price." Mark's jaw tightened, his mind racing with anger and frustration. He had no choice. Not if he wanted to protect the others. Not if he wanted to survive long enough to find a way out of this nightmare. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, "but don't think for a second that I'm doing this for you." Zeno's mandibles twitched in what might have been a smile. "Oh, I don't care why you do it, as long as you do." Mark's fate, once again, was tied to the fight. But this time, it wasn't just his life on the line. It was the lives of every human still trapped in this alien hell. Mark Anderson's footsteps echoed in the hollow metal corridors of the Arantz ship, his thoughts heavy as he was escorted deeper into unfamiliar territory. The cold, sterile walls gradually gave way to something entirely different, a sudden shift from the grim utilitarian design to luxury that reminded him of the opulence of Earth's wealthiest elite. The transition was jarring, as if the ship itself had two faces, one for its prisoners and another for its guests. The floor was lined with deep, rich carpeting that muffled the sound of his boots, and alien artwork, golden sculptures and strange abstract paintings, adorned the walls. The lighting became warmer, almost comforting, like the soft glow of candles or sunlight streaming through a window, something he hadn't seen since Earth was lost. The corridors were wide and grand, with doors on either side that looked as though they led to the suites of royalty, like a five-star hotel. Mark's gaze flicked to the doors they passed. Some were open, revealing lavish rooms inside, with Arantz guests lounging in luxury, while others were closed, hiding whatever decadence or dealings took place behind them. Despite the beauty around him, there was an unsettling feeling of isolation, as if this place was built to deceive. distracting from the darker reality that lay just beneath its golden surface. Two Arantz guards flanked him, their insectoid faces unreadable, their claws resting on the hilts of their weapons. Ahead of them, at the end of the long corridor, were two grand doors, tall and wide, adorned with intricate carvings that shimmered with a golden hue. It was clear this was no ordinary room. It had the feel of a throne room, or something even more exclusive. One of the guards stepped forward, placing its clawed hand against a small panel beside the doors. A red beam of light shot out from the panel, scanning the group. Mark stood still, not daring to move as the light passed over him, sweeping up and down his body. When it finished, the doors slid open with a smooth, almost silent hiss. What lay beyond the doors made even the luxurious corridor look modest in comparison. The room beyond was enormous, a vast, grand space filled with rich tapestries, golden furniture, and a view of the stars through large, transparent panels. It was like stepping into a penthouse on the Vegas Strip, but with a surreal, alien twist. The ceiling was high, arching above like the dome of a cathedral, and the light was soft and ambient, casting everything in a dreamlike glow. Mark was pushed inside by the guards, and as the doors slid shut behind him, he found himself standing alone in the presence of yet another alien species. These beings, however, were different from the Arantz. They were almost human. They had a blue-tinted skin, but their arms, legs, and faces were strikingly similar to his own kind. They had hair, long and flowing in shades of silver and gold, and their eyes, though slightly larger and more almond-shaped than human eyes, held a depth of intelligence and curiosity that made Mark feel exposed. As Mark stood in the center of the room, taking in the alien grandeur, one of the royal guards approached him. This guard, unlike the Arantz, had a more human-like appearance. His blue skin was accented by a shining suit of armor, and his eyes gleamed as he scanned Mark with a handheld device, probably checking for weapons or hidden dangers. Satisfied, the guard stepped back and motioned for Mark to proceed further into the room. Just then, from the far side of the chamber, a voice boomed with regal authority. "Ah, the human," said a tall figure standing by a grand table made of a strange, shimmering metal. "Welcome, Mark Anderson. I am King Gladius, ruler of the Moors." Mark turned to face the speaker. King Gladius stood tall, his blue skin contrasting sharply against the rich golden tones of his royal attire. His hair was silver, long and tied back, and his presence radiated power and command. But his eyes, though cold and calculating, held a flicker of interest. Behind him, seated in lavish chairs, were two young women, their appearances almost identical. They had the same blue skin and silver hair as their father, but their features were softer, more delicate. Their eyes sparkled with an unmistakable sense of wonder as they gazed at Mark. "My daughters," Gladius continued, gesturing toward the two women. "Princess Morina and Princess Karina. They were most impressed by your performance in the arena today. In fact, they pleaded with me to arrange this meeting." The two princesses rose from their seats, almost starstruck as they approached Mark. He felt their gaze sweep over him, and though he had faced down monstrous creatures in the arena, the intensity of their curiosity made him feel strangely exposed. "You are remarkable," Morina said softly, her voice filled with fascination. "You look so much like us. I've never seen anything like it." Karina reached out, her hands grazing his chest and arms as though she were examining a rare artifact. "Yes," she whispered, "almost identical, but different. Stronger in a way." Mark stood rigid, uncertain of what to do as both princesses began touching him, tugging at his shirt, feeling his muscles, and even running their fingers through his hair. "They are like us," Karina said, her voice tinged with awe. She gently tugged at his lips, revealing his teeth. "Remarkable, Daddy. We have to find out more about them. These humans. There must be some connection." King Gladius chuckled, watching his daughters with amusement. "I wonder," he said, stroking his chin, "if we share a common ancestor, or if the gods simply ran out of imagination when they created us." Mark said nothing, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. He was no stranger to attention. Back on Earth, he had been a fighter, a leader of a failed rebellion. But this, being treated like some exotic specimen by alien royalty, was something entirely different. The princesses finally stepped back, their fascination still evident in their eyes. They returned to their seats, but their gaze never left Mark. "Sit, Mark Anderson," Gladius said, motioning to a chair near the grand table. "Let us talk." Reluctantly, Mark took a seat. He knew this was more than just idle curiosity. There was always an agenda. He had learned that lesson many times since Earth had fallen. Gladius leaned back in his chair, his piercing blue eyes studying Mark carefully. "Tell us of your world, of Earth. We know so little about your people, other than that the Dragul destroyed your home. But you survived. I want to know how." Mark hesitated for a moment, but there was no point in holding back. The Dragul were ruthless conquerors. Whatever secrets Earth had once held, they were now ashes. So he spoke. He told them of Earth, of its beauty, its history, and its downfall. He spoke of the Dragul invasion, the desperate fight for survival, and how the scattered remnants of humanity fled into space, hoping to find a new home. The Moors listened intently, their expressions shifting between curiosity and empathy as Mark recounted the tale of his people's destruction. "It's tragic," Morina said softly when Mark finished. "To lose everything, your home, your people, and now you fight for your life in the arena." Mark nodded, though he felt a pang of regret deep in his chest. The memories of Earth's last days were still raw, still painful. "And yet," Gladius said, leaning forward, "you have shown remarkable resilience. That is something I admire." Mark wasn't sure how to respond to that. He didn't feel resilient. He felt tired, beaten down by the endless struggle for survival. But there was something in the way Gladius spoke, a sense of respect that he hadn't expected. For hours, they spoke. Gladius told Mark of the Moors, of their world that orbited a blue dwarf star, casting everything in a soft azure light. He spoke of their history, their culture, and their place in the galaxy. It was clear the Moors were a powerful people, and despite their outward elegance, there was an undercurrent of ruthlessness in everything Gladius said. As the conversation wore on, Mark found himself growing more uneasy. He didn't trust them, not fully. There was too much they weren't saying, too much left unsaid, but for now, he played along, answering their questions and learning what he could. Finally, the doors to the grand room slid open again, and the Arantz guards re-entered. "It seems our time is up," Gladius said with a smile. "But I must say, Mark Anderson, this has been a most enlightening conversation. I hope we will meet again." Before Mark could respond, Morina spoke up. "Father, please, we must see him again. There's so much more we need to learn." Karina nodded in agreement, her eyes still fixed on Mark. "He's fascinating, Daddy. We can't let him leave without learning more." Gladius chuckled, clearly amused by his daughter's enthusiasm. "Very well, I will speak with the overseer and arrange another meeting." The princesses beamed, clearly pleased with the outcome. As the guards led Mark from the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into a game he didn't fully understand. The Moors were dangerous, perhaps not in the same way as the Dragul or the Arantz, but dangerous nonetheless, and now he had caught their attention. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. Mark lay on the hard bed in his cell, staring at the ceiling, the dull ache of his wounds gradually becoming more bearable. His body was bruised and battered from the last fight in the arena, but it was the exhaustion deep in his bones that weighed on him the most. The brutal reality of his situation sank in every time he closed his eyes. He was a prisoner, fighting for his life in a system that treated him as nothing more than entertainment. The small luxuries of his new cell, a bed, a toilet, and slightly more space, did little to ease his thoughts. He knew the comfort was a reward for winning in the arena, but it felt more like a gilded cage. He had seen the cruelty of his captors, and knew the better things got, the more dangerous his situation became. After a few hours, as his body began to drift into a fitful sleep, the door to his cell slid open. Instinctively, Mark sat up, ready for whatever new ordeal awaited him. But instead of a guard, Morina stepped in. The light from the corridor illuminated her face, and she greeted him with a bright smile, her blue-tinted skin shimmering in the dim light of his cell. She was dressed in a flowing, ornate gown, her silver hair cascading down her back. There was a spark of excitement in her eyes, a stark contrast to the grim surroundings. "Hello, Mark," she said, her voice soft and filled with excitement. Mark blinked, momentarily stunned by her unexpected visit. "Morina? What are you doing here?" She walked over to him with the grace of royalty and sat down beside him on the edge of his bed, her closeness startling. Mark tensed but didn't move, unsure of what to make of her presence. He had seen her earlier, with her father, King Gladius, and her sister Corina. Now, here she was, in his cell, acting as though they were old friends. "I couldn't wait to see you again," she said, her eyes sparkling with a mix of curiosity and something else Mark couldn't quite place. She looked younger up close, her enthusiasm almost childlike, but there was a depth in her gaze that suggested she knew more than she let on. Mark wasn't sure how to respond. He had expected isolation, not this. "Why?" he asked simply, unable to mask the confusion in his voice. She laughed lightly, her hand resting on his arm as if the question amused her. "Why not?" she teased, her fingers brushing against his skin. "I've never met anyone like you before. My sister and I, well, we've been fascinated since the moment we saw you. You're different." Her touch lingered for a moment longer than was necessary, and Mark's mind raced. Was she flirting with him? He hadn't expected this. A princess from an alien species, showing interest in him of all people, seemed like something out of a dream, or a trap. He wasn't sure which. "I wanted to tell you more about my family," Morina continued, seemingly unaware of his hesitation. "We have a great deal of influence in this galaxy, more than even my father lets on. But sometimes, I feel like I don't understand him. He's always up to something." She laughed again, a light, melodic sound that didn't quite match the weight of her words. Mark looked at her closely, trying to gauge her intent. Was she warning him, or was this just idle chatter? He wasn't sure what game she was playing, but something about the whole situation felt off. Morina's hand was still on his arm, and she squeezed it gently before letting go. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I don't care. I like you, Mark. I think you're special." Mark blinked. Special? What was her angle? He wasn't sure if she was genuinely interested in him or if this was part of some larger manipulation. "I have to go," Morina said suddenly, standing up. She leaned in close, her face inches from his, and pressed her forehead against his in an intimate gesture. Mark froze, unsure how to react. Was this some sort of alien version of a hug? He didn't know, but the gesture felt strangely personal. "Goodbye, Mark," she whispered softly before turning and walking toward the door. He watched her go, her form illuminated by the corridor light as she disappeared through the doorway. The door slid shut behind her, and Mark was left alone in the dim cell once more, his mind racing. What had just happened? Why had she come to see him? And what did she mean about her father being up to something? He sat back down on the bed, perplexed by Morina's visit. Was she toying with him, or was there more to her words than he understood? The fact that she was opening up to him at all was troubling enough. He knew better than to trust too easily. He'd seen what happened when you trusted the wrong people. Mark lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece it all together. What did any of this have to do with him? Was it just curiosity, or something deeper? He felt like a pawn in a game he couldn't see. An hour passed. Mark's body relaxed, but his mind continued to race. The silence of the cell was interrupted again by the familiar sound of the door sliding open. Mark's heart skipped, thinking it was Morina again, but the figure that stepped into the room wasn't her. It was Corina. Corina? Mark sat up quickly, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Corina entered the room slowly, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression far more serious than her sister's had been. There was no playful smile, no teasing. She stopped a few steps from his bed, her blue eyes locking onto his. "I had to come," she said quietly. "I needed to talk to you." Mark frowned, more confused than ever. "About what?" She hesitated for a moment, then looked around as if to make sure no one was listening. "My father, he's planning something big. I don't know what it is, but I have a bad feeling about it." Mark's mind raced again. First Morina, now Corina, both hinting at secrets, both clearly unsettled by their father's actions. What was going on? "Why are you telling me this?" Mark asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. "Why would you care what your father is planning?" Corina took a deep breath and sat down in the chair opposite him, her gaze never wavering. "Because I think you're involved, Mark. He's been meeting with many different species lately, more than usual. And whenever I ask him about it, he brushes me off. But you, he seems very interested in you. He's up to something, and I don't like it." Mark's pulse quickened. He'd sensed something was off, but hearing it confirmed by Karina made it feel more real and more dangerous. "What do you want from me?" Mark asked carefully. Karina leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to help you. If I can arrange for you to be freed from the fighting pits, would you help me?" Mark raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Help you with what?" "I don't know yet," Karina admitted, frustration evident in her voice. "But I know my father is up to something, and I can't just sit back and watch it happen. I need someone on the inside, someone I can trust. And you're different. You've survived things that no one else could." Mark didn't know what to say. Could he trust her? Was she really offering to free him, or was this another game? "If you can help me get out of here, I'll do whatever I can to help you," Mark said cautiously. "But only if it's safe for you. I don't want you getting hurt because of me." Karina's face broke into a wide smile, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "I always get what I want, Mark. You'll see." She stood up and without another word, turned and left the cell. The door slid shut behind her, leaving Mark alone once more. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. Morina's flirtation, Karina's warning, it was all too much. He rubbed his face, feeling the tension build. This wasn't just about surviving in the arena anymore. Something far bigger was unfolding, and he was caught in the middle of it. Whatever King Gladius was planning, it involved him, and that terrified him more than the fights ever had. As he lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized that this, whatever it was, might be far more dangerous than the arena itself. Another day had passed in the twisted, alien world. Mark now found himself trapped in. The cold metal door of his cell slid open, and once again, the looming forms of the Arantz guards appeared to escort him to the overseer. Each step echoed through the ship's stark metallic corridors, a constant reminder of the chains he couldn't escape. The bruises on his body had barely begun to heal, but it wasn't the physical pain that weighed him down, it was the uncertainty of what was to come. The overseer's chamber was as dark and imposing as ever. The Arantz overseer, Zeno, sat behind a curved desk made from alien metals, his multifaceted eyes glittering with amusement as Mark approached. "Ah, Mark Anderson," Zeno said with a sneer. "You've made quite an impression on our guests, especially King Gladius's daughters. Fascinating creatures, the Moors, aren't they?" Mark stiffened at the mention of Morina and Karina, forcing himself to stay composed. His mind flashed back to his last encounters with them, especially the cryptic warnings from Karina about her father's plans. "And now, Morina, a representative from the Moor royal family has approached me," Zeno continued, his voice dripping with amusement. "They inquired about purchasing your contract. Can you imagine that? A royal family wanting to buy a human gladiator?" He chuckled, the sound grating against Mark's ears. "But why would I let you go? You're still unproven. I don't know if you'll be a champion or a failure." Mark kept his face impassive, though disappointment gnawed at him. It had been a fleeting hope, the idea of freedom, however temporary, from this hellish existence. But now it seemed further away than ever. "Are you going to make me fight again?" Mark asked, his voice tight, dreading the answer. "Of course," Zeno replied, his grin widening. "Your first fight was just an evaluation to see if you had any potential. You survived. But now, we have something more fitting. You'll face a species champion. One-on-one. To the death, naturally." Mark's stomach churned at the thought. "When?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "In 2 days," Zeno said. "And this time you'll have some freedom aboard the ship. You can train, research your opponent, whatever you need to do. But remember, there's no escape. Your people are still in our custody, 'cause any trouble and their suffering will be intensified." Mark clenched his fists, rage bubbling beneath the surface, but he kept his expression neutral. There was no point in fighting back now. He'd have to survive this next challenge, just as he had the last. Later that day, Mark was once again brought before the Moor royal family. The lavish room, the alien splendor, the opulence of their world, it all felt like a strange dream in contrast to the brutal reality of his life as a prisoner. Morina and Karina greeted him with their usual flirtatious energy, but as Mark spoke of the upcoming fight, Karina's face grew grim. 2 days, Karina asked, her voice soft but strained. Morina, always more emotional, immediately turned to her father, pleading, "Father, you have to stop this. You can't let them force Mark to fight again. He's not some animal for their entertainment. Gladius shook his head, his expression regretful but firm. The Arantz will not relent, Morina. We are guests here. If I interfere, it will cause unnecessary conflict. Mark will simply have to prove himself again. He has shown resilience before. Mark felt the weight of those words pressing down on him, the reality that no one, no matter how royal, would be able to stop what was coming. The days passed quickly. Mark spent hours in the training bay with a species called the Wrens, large muscular beings with hardened, scaly skin. One of them, a towering Wren named Passeta, befriended him, taking him under his wing and guiding him through training sessions that left Mark drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Passeta explained in detail what Mark needed to know about his upcoming opponent. A Dragul, Passeta had said, his voice a low growl. They're a warrior race, known for their brute strength and merciless tactics. They destroyed your planet, didn't they? You'll be fighting one of their best. At the mention of the Dragul, something ignited inside Mark. Rage filled his veins as he pounded his fists into the heavy bag Passeta held for him. Images of Earth, of the Dragul ships raining destruction upon his home, fueled his every strike. His muscles ached, but he kept going, driving his body to the brink of exhaustion. He couldn't lose. Not again. Not to one of them. After training, Mark was granted the rare luxury of a shower. The hot water ran down his aching body, washing away the grime of battle and the torment of his mind, if only for a brief moment. As he cleaned up and prepared to return to his cell, his thoughts were a swirling storm of fear, anger, and confusion. The fight was coming, and no amount of physical training could prepare him for what lay ahead. He returned to his cell, exhausted but mentally sharper. As the door slid open, he was greeted by an unexpected sight. Morina was lying on his bed, wearing barely anything at all, her body draped across the sheets in a way that left little to the imagination. Her blue-tinted skin shimmered in the dim light of the cell, and her long hair flowed down her back like silver threads. "I've been waiting for you," she said with a playful smile, her eyes locking onto his as she propped herself up on her elbows. Mark froze in the doorway, his mind reeling. "Morina, what are you doing here?" She stretched lazily, her bare legs shifting as she sat up slightly, her body exuding an irresistible allure. "I couldn't stay away. I've been thinking about you, Mark. About us." Her voice was soft, but there was a fire behind her words, a burning intensity that left Mark at a loss. He knew this didn't make sense. None of it did. But he found himself walking toward her, sitting down on the bed by her legs. "I don't know what's going to happen in the next day or two," Morina said quietly, her eyes searching his face, "but I knew I couldn't hold back my feelings any longer." She leaned into him, her lips brushing against his, and Mark found himself unable to resist. He kissed her back, their passion quickly growing as she pulled him down beside her. Her touch was electric, her body bending to his movements in perfect harmony. Every kiss, every caress felt like a release from the torment that had consumed him for so long. For the first time since Earth's destruction, Mark felt alive, truly alive. The minutes they spent together were a blur of passion and discovery, their bodies moving together in a way that transcended words, cultures, and species. The alien barriers between them fell away, leaving only two beings, lost in the intensity of the moment. When it was over, they lay together, breathing heavily, their bodies intertwined. Morina eventually slipped out of bed, her movements slow and deliberate as she dressed herself, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd give you something to fight for, Mark. Please, come back to me." She kissed him one last time before slipping out of the cell, not looking back. Mark lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind swirling with emotions he couldn't control. His body ached, but his heart ached more. How had this happened? How had he found something or someone so special in the midst of such chaos? As exhaustion finally took hold, he closed his eyes, drifting off into a restless sleep, his thoughts filled with the image of Morina and the uncertainty of the fight that awaited him. He had to survive. Not just for himself, but for her.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to see what's next for our group of survivors.